We are back. You are chatting with John P. Today, we are going to be talking about ways that you can take care of your watch, and certainly ways that you should take care of your watch. As a watch dealer here with DelReyWatch.com, we see a lot of watches that come in the door that perhaps could have been taken care of a little bit better. A lot of these things can be rectified, especially with a master watchmaker like we have on staff, Hans, but some things are easily preventable, and in this list I'm going to share with you, I think that you can find some things that maybe you haven't thought of, even if you've been around for a while in the watch collecting, in the whole watch collecting space. And if you're new to the channel, what we do is we obviously talk about watches, and if you've been around for a while, or perhaps you're new and you'd like to like and subscribe, I definitely would appreciate that. Also, at DelReyWatch.com, we have this very cool Eberhard 8-day gold watch. It's really interesting. It looks a lot like a Patek, but for a fraction of the price, full kit box and papers. At least check it out at Del Rey Watch and let me know what you think about it, because it looks just like a Patek for a fraction of the price, so I think you get a lot of value there. Let's jump right into this list. The first thing that I recommend is do not open your watch. Now, sometimes we get pictures from fellow collectors out there that say, hey, here's the inside of my watch. What do you think about it? And it'll be like a current production Rolex or current production A. Langensohn. No, there's a see-through case back on that one. I kid. But, we get these pictures of guys that'll open up their watches, and it's such a bad idea. I cannot stress this enough. So I'm not saying that necessarily you'll be clumsy and you'll fidget with it or try to regulate it yourself, but just the added exposure and the dust in the case can cause problems down the road, especially if you're taking the entire case back off and this is happening over and over again. You might not think about it, but all watchmakers have a very clean and sterile environment that they work in. That's why they have the gloves, the lab coat, and the environment is meticulously maintained, and all of the dust is removed for the environment. And a lot of the times they have special systems that will actually set not only the certain humidity levels to be optimal for working on the watches, but also to remove the dust and some of the moisture, and you just don't have that in your house, I'm guessing. And so sometimes we see that, and it's just cringeworthy, because also you're voiding your warranty, right? You're voiding your warranty through the manufacturer, and even from a pre-owned dealer. Any dealer out there is going to say, if you opened up the watch and you tinkered with it, unfortunately anything could have happened. So that's the first thing. Please do not open up your watch. You can circumvent that by, first of all, knowing what's in the watch, but also just trusting your dealer, and I think you have nothing to worry about. Moving on to cleaning your watch. Now, first, don't use chemicals. Chemicals can be very bad, depending on what it is. I know there's a lot of guys out there who will say, well, technically this chemical's okay because this and that. It's very safe advice to just not use chemicals on the watch. Now, I've seen guys use Windex and bleach, and the craziest things I've heard people doing, especially in my earlier days on the forums, maybe 10 years ago, I see people do this. It's just cringeworthy because, unless you're a chemist, you really don't know what those metals can do to you don't know what those chemicals can do to the metals. And also, what if some of that seeps in and manages to get through the gaskets? Maybe if it's an older watch, the gaskets are not perfectly sealing the watch and some of that gets in there. It's just trouble. It's absolutely trouble, and maybe it'll start corroding the case depending on the case metal. It's a very bad idea. Now, they do have some specialty cleaning cloths for watches. There's so many things that they're coming out with these days, and they have some other cloths for polishing, like the Cape Cod cloth. But if you just take a moist washcloth and do this regularly, you should be able to cut down a lot of the debris that collects on the watches. I'll admit, and I'm not singling anyone out here, but occasionally we'll get a watch in the door that is just absolutely incredibly dirty, and it becomes very difficult when that happens, we actually have to send that to the case refinisher, because the dirt and the pieces of skin collect on the watch, and it just cakes in there, and it bakes down, and it just becomes one with the watch, almost like a moss or something. It's very bad to do. It's not going to necessarily ruin the watch. It's just, if it collects long enough, it becomes very difficult to get that dirt and grime off the watch. So please take care of it. Wash your watch. You will probably thank yourself. And certainly if you ever go to sell the watch, people will thank you for that as well. So moving on to servicing. Servicing is generally advised by brands and manufacturers to every 5 to 7 years. I'll say for vintage watches, you probably want to be inside that spec, especially when parts start wearing down. The last thing that you want is a part to wear down and then for the watch to break in action and the repair bill go much higher and you need parts. And sometimes you can't find the parts for vintage movements like a Valjoux 72 or any of those old chronograph movements. It can be very difficult to source parts because they don't make them anymore sometimes. So service every 5 to 7 years for vintage is a great idea. For modern, sure, you can probably push the interval a little bit longer, especially with modern Rolex, because the movements, even though they don't tell you this, they really are designed to run for a long time. So at least have the watch looked at every 5 to 7 years. I don't say that you need to have a full service, but make sure that you're aware of what's going on with the mechanical components of the watch, especially if you plan to keep it for a long time, just because, once again, if parts become scarce, the last thing you want is a very difficult repair to do, needing parts. So, rolling on to the watches that are in your winder or your safe. By the way, I don't necessarily always recommend a winder because they're pretty unnecessary unless there's a crazy complication or like a perpetual that you need to make sure you don't have to keep setting it over and over again. But anyway, moving on to this, always check on your watches that are in storage. Now, I generally advise that every so often, if you have watches that are not being worn, you just go in there and you wind it up a little bit. If it's automatic or hand wind, manual wind, just give it a good wind. Make sure that it still does get some action and some play, because it's kind of hard to believe, but sometimes when watches are left sitting for a long period of time, the oils kind of cake up and they dry, and it's actually worse for the watch. Now, it's kind of hard to think about it, but I had this conversation with Hans, and I really need to pull him on this channel so he can describe it from a watchmaker's perspective. But once again, those oils kind of cake up and dry, and the movement's not used to being used. It's kind of like if you were to have a car and let it sit for 15 years. Well, there's going to be some issues with that engine, I think. Once again, not a mechanic on cars, but it's that same kind of thing. Just give it a wind, make sure that the watch is still functioning properly, warm it up, get it going. At least you'll give yourself some peace of mind, but also ensure that the watch is still working and the oils are not drying up on it. Next, please get yourself a proper strap changing tool. The thing is, we see a lot of watches that come in the door, right? Delray watch. And some of these watches, actually a lot of these watches have some scratches by the lugs. And in the modern day times of kind of a strap culture, especially, with Panerai and some of the other brands, people like to swap out the straps. Even myself, I like to swap out straps. And you can see the marks where people were swapping out their straps, and that's always an issue for people, right? They look at the lugs, it's the first place to look at, and they see the scratches, and they don't want to refinish the case, and they have to do just that spot, and it becomes a bit of an issue. So if you can just get yourself a $5 strap tool, you can certainly retain more of the integrity of the case, and any future purchasers of that watch or people you're trading against will not have any issues with that. And it's just a good idea, especially for gold watches, because gold scratches so easily, and some people will use knives or X-Acto blades and things like that, and one slip, or if you get frustrated, one slip can put a gouge in your gold watch, and definitely stainless steel as well. So you don't want to do that. Get a very cheap strap changing tool, and you will thank me later. Now, this one's a little bit interesting next, because it involves magnets. Now, with watches, there's metal components on the inside, and not all watches are created and developed to be able to resist magnetic fields. Now, of course, you have like the Milgauss and the Ingenieur by IWC, and they're made to withstand certain, levels of magnetic fields, but generally speaking, most watches are really not. And there's metal components on the inside, there's levers, there's gears, and these things can be the performance of them can be swayed by magnetic fields, right? Magnetic fields have the ability to move metals, and there's metal in there. And so if you expose your watch to magnets, now maybe if you're at a junkyard or in medical settings, or maybe even certain types of diagnostic imaging machines, maybe like an MRI or something like that, these things can be harmful to the watch, because then you have to demagnetize the watch, and you have to take it to a professional watchmaker and make sure that everything is demagnetized, and then you have to re-regulate it and make sure that it's within certain seconds per day. Otherwise, you can have an issue with the watch. And so it's generally advised to keep the watch away from magnets, and you can prevent any of these issues related to magnetic fields. And lastly, know the water resistance of your watch. Now, dive watches are very, very popular in modern times. Rolex Submariner, Omega Seamaster, you name it. There's so many dive watches out there, and new ones are coming out every day, and they're made to be put in the water. But not all watches are, right? Even if a chronograph is water rated, unless it's something that is, like one of these chronographs that has the screw down pushers and, very tight seals on that, don't expose chronographs to water, and make sure that even if your watch is not a chronograph, you know what the water resistance rating is. I've even seen AP watches where someone has taken the watch apart at their house, and they open up the case because they were fiddling with it, and they put it back together, and they got water damage inside the watch. And I think the repair bill was something like $7,000 with AP because of the type of damage that was done. And there was damage to the dial, and of course all of these things are expensive with the manufacturer, and that was an in-production watch. When you start talking about water damage on watches that are no longer in production, there may be nothing that you can do. For example, if the dial gets ruined because you just had to go swimming with your watch and it wasn't properly water resistance tested, and you get damage on the dial, sometimes there's nothing they can do because they just don't produce the dials anymore. So maybe they'll get the movement functioning. Maybe they're still using pieces of that movement today, and they can, take care of you on that front. But with the dial, forget about it. So always advised, know the water resistance of your watch. If you think that you want to go swimming with it, you want to go diving with it, make sure that you have the water resistance tested at least to 100 meters. And the other thing I should talk about is sometimes we get emails and someone will say, hey, I want to go in the hot tub, or I want to go in the sauna. Yeah, technically, based on the water resistance rating, you should be allowed to do that. But there's been some accounts of people going into the, into the hot tubs, or, the sauna, whatever you want to call it. And even though the watch was water resistance tested, they somehow still got fog inside the watch. So, maybe the heat somehow made the seals break down a little bit and they weren't before, something along those lines. If there's anybody that is somehow a water engineer and understands how these things work, leave in the comments below. But there have been verified instances where people that had waterproof watches or water resistant watches jumped into the hot tub and fog got on the inside of the watch. So I always advise against it if you can, just to err on the safe side. I mean, these are expensive items, and surely you want to take care of them into the future. So always be cautious with certain things, unless you're a risk taker. For the added enjoyment of wearing your watch in the hot tub, maybe it's worth the risk for you of risking your $8,000 watch. The choice is yours. Let me know in the comments below if this is you. Also, do you have any other tips that maybe I missed on this list? In the world of watches, there's so many people with so many opinions. I love hearing yours. Do not forget to like and subscribe. I do appreciate it. And find me on Instagram, The Real John P. Quick episode for you here, guys. It's Monday. It's back to work. Hope everyone has a great week. This has been Chatting with John P. Ciao.